priest in the middle of the church was distracted from his thoughts by a man who burst in and opened the door, shouting in a panic that the man was already here. He continued to run towards the priest, waving his arms and shouting that it was no longer safe and they should run away. However, the priest did not show any signs of panic, but simply asked the frightened monk who he was talking about. He asked in a trembling voice if he had not heard the rumors about Humite Street. Then, shuddering even more, he said that the man he called the Leakin Killer, Vampire Slayer, and Lord of the Blue Devils was on his way here with his army of undead. After which he continued, he added that he would not let the Dark Order leave so easily, and would kill them in the most brutal way. However, the priest only laughed after hearing the monk's words, and smiling, he replied that they had nothing to worry about. Since they had the best order of holy knights with them, whose squad was considered the strongest in the entire empire. However, the monk heard this even more in a panic of understanding what will happen to him, grabbed his head, then answered the priest that the knights he was talking about had already become undead and were on their way here. In the middle of the crowd of knights who were no longer living people, there was a guy with a blue aura emanating from him. With a gloating grin on his face, he raised his hand, then created a cross of light, in the center of which was a circle. This sign began to glow bright blue light. At the same time the guy ordered his army of undead to move forward, following the bright beam of light that came out of the cross and directing the army, who followed the order with fierce roars, rushed towards their target. At the same time, the priests who were standing inside the church talking suddenly heard some noise. When they turned around, they were horrified to see the shadows of many hands pounding on the glass in an attempt to break it and break in. As expected, the glass could not withstand such an onslaught, and the next moment it cracked. The last barrier separating the priests from their deaths was shattered. In the next second, the army of undead, which no longer had anything blocking its way, rushed inside with a fierce roar, chasing after the priests, who began to flee in panic. However, they were unable to do so, as the zombies immediately caught up with them and threw them to the ground, preventing them from moving. The monk who had informed the priest of the impending danger, lying on the ground pinned by the undead, began to beg for mercy. Unfortunately, the undead zombies did not understand human speech, which led to the fact that these words were his last. At the same time, the priest, who had not yet become a zombie, was looking at something with horror. Coming down the stairs was a guy with a gun on his shoulder, who even despite his seemingly young age looked particularly horrifying in this environment. Unable to look at it any longer, the priest turned around and started trying to crawl away, unable to believe that the guy was controlling the undead, even though it was supposed to be serving them, namely the necromancers. His escape was never successful, however, as the next moment someone's foot stepped on his arm, causing severe pain. Glaring angrily at the guy to whom the foot belonged, the priest told him that no matter how hard he tried to stop them, God would still grant salvation to their souls. Salvation, retorted the boy contemptuously, holding the gun to the priest's head. I'll do it instead, said the guy, whereupon his weapon began to glow with a bright blue light. The priest lying on the ground, with tears in his eyes, felt the divine power seeping into his skin, while the darkness that was inside him began to come out of him. The next moment, with the words that the god's blessing would take him to hell, he pulled the trigger. The blue light from the muzzle illuminated everything around him, starting a new legend about the youngest necromancer. Let's go back to the beginning of our story, which began much earlier. In the luxurious castle that belonged to the holy emperor who ruled this kingdom, were heard gossiping two servants, one of whom began to tell his interlocutor the latest rumors that he had heard about the second prince, who from his words was a disgrace to the kingdom. To them he was the bottom of humanity without moral principles, and they could not believe how such a man could be born in a kingdom ruled by a holy emperor. Then remembering the incident with the archbishop, in which the prince harassed his daughter, which resulted in punishment. However, the guy didn't put up with it, instead of just accepting the punishment, decided to take revenge and spoiled the archbishop's chambers. Hearing of this, the holy emperor, who could no longer tolerate the antics of his son, banished him to the land of the dead spirits, so that he could finally think about his misdeeds and finally come to his senses. But that didn't do any good. After all, the guy started doing dirty deeds again, which eventually led to the fact that he tried to commit suicide after the girl's refusal. However, he somehow managed to survive. The biggest oddity was not that he managed to survive, but that after that incident it was as if he had become a completely different person. To everyone's surprise, he changed for the better. He began to work hard in the monastery, helped the needy, was a model teenager who could be set as an example, and generally stopped making trouble for himself. After this change, many people in the city began to like him, but even more began to treat him with suspicion, as he suddenly changed beyond recognition, which could not help but look suspicious. These suspicions led to rumors and opinions that a demon had entered the prince's body after he had committed blasphemy, or that the prince had made a contract with a demon. Others told of seeing a corpse walking around the monastery. All in all, rumors abounded. "What do you think?" asked the guy, turning to the two zombies who sat in front of him, hoping to get honest answers from them. The zombies who possessed intelligence that was capable of conquering the world, and communicating in a language that was inaccessible to mere mortals, with a clever look something growled in his language. The prince stared at the zombie, wondering what he should do. A hologram window of his condition was displayed above his head. It indicated that the guy was 16-year-old Alan Alphals. In addition, the status window indicated that he was the exiled 7th prince, and that he belonged to the Necromancer class. While the zombies, who were completely aware of this world, looked at their master, the prince, wondering why the status window was appearing by itself, closed it with a wave of his hand. Then scratching his head he turned to the zombies who were sitting in front of him on their knees, said that he thought that someone had seen them walking here, which was the reason for the rumors. He added with a sigh that if this continued he would be falsely accused of hereticism, and besides he was no longer the real Alan Alphals. Before that, he was just an ordinary person from Korea, but then he suddenly became the worthless son of the Holy Emperor. When he woke up in his new body, he found himself hanging from a noose. Fortunately, however, the rope broke, which was his salvation. He then discovered that he could see system windows, but that wasn't the only new ability he had. As it turned out, he also possessed the abilities of a necromancer, which helped him to fulfill his duties as a cemetery keeper. Unfortunately, here, people with such abilities were called heretics. Even the zombies were sad to hear the news. As Alan looked at the zombies that were sitting obediently on his lap and looked at him with their intelligent eyes, he thought about how at first he couldn't make sense of everything that had come upon him, but now he was beginning to understand what was going on. The question before him was whether he should have continued. They had actually worked well together at first. He had a zombie grave digger and a zombie burying zombie, which together managed to do a pretty good job in the cemetery. Everything was going so well that they could even afford to relax and enjoy the rest after a great day's work. However, now it was probably time for them to say goodbye. Hearing this, the zombies began to panic. One of them clutched his head in confusion, not knowing what he would do now. The second expressed his displeasure by trying to rebel, while the third began to cry from despair. Alan, not wanting to see all this, ordered them to calm down. Then turning to the blue-eyed zombie, he told him to wipe the foam on his rebellious mouth. Picking up the shovel, he added that he just wanted to say that he had a difficult first life, which he would tell about a little later. And that's why he would like to live his second life quietly and peacefully, he finished, holding the shovel in front of him, while behind him appeared the face of some magical clock that glowed bright blue. However, all was not yet lost for the zombie, as the guy shining like some kind of saint with a bright light that could only be seen through sunglasses, he added with a smile on his face in a soothing voice that since they were pretty close, he would think about it. "Deal?" he asked, making his usual face. To which the zombies, touched by his kindness, gave him a thumbs up in agreement. "Then let's get to work," said the guy to the excited zombies so they wouldn't relax after the good news. "Did you hear that?" the man with the mask on his face asked his companion worriedly. When he continued driving the cart with two blue corpses with bags on their heads, he irritatedly told him to stop talking and help him push the cart. Adding that if he didn't, they would probably end up like the corpses in the cart. "Let's hurry up and go to the prince and ask him to help this damned village," the man added in a grim voice. As it turned out, this seemingly harmless village was not so simple. In the crack of the open wooden door, where someone's face, which like the hair was pale white in color, was looking outward. There was a blood-red eye, staring outward with a mad look. "Are these the last corpses?" Alan asked the men, looking at the two blue-haired corpses with bags over their heads, over which flies were flying. To which the black-haired man replied that it seemed so, while the red-haired man confirmed his partner's words, adding that many of them had died, while the rest had simply fled. Then turning to the prince, who had already removed the sack from the corpse's head, the men asked him if he could come to the village. He turned around and asked them why it was necessary. The two men excitedly started gesticulating with their hands and began to talk about how almost all the villagers had been wiped out, adding that they would be safer with the prince, as they were probably fine because they saw him often while they were carrying the corpses. To which the stone-faced man thought to himself that a blasphemous prince like him didn't have that kind of power. The men, however, did not give up, but even went on the offensive, using one of the dirtiest tricks of all, tearfully begging him to help them. Clinging to the prince, they tearfully began to ask him what would happen to them if they also fell ill, and besides, who would then transport the corpses to him. Indeed, there might be a problem with the supply of corpses, as there aren't many people I can trust. Looks like I'll have to save this village, for the sake of innocent souls who don't deserve to die, of course. The medieval village, whose houses were made of wood, was immersed in a gloomy atmosphere. Walking along the road between the houses, Alan also noticed that the village looked really scary. The two men behind him and following at his heels looked even more frightened, even though this was their hometown. Alan clutched the shovel tightly and held it out in front of him, looking around as he cautiously moved forward. One of them tearfully warned the prince to be careful, because the waterworks had stopped working, and deep puddles had formed all over the city. The boy turned around irritably and told them to take their hands off him. The man complainingly replied that they should have a blessing on them at all times. Alan was not quite satisfied with being a mascot. Continuing on his way, he told the men that if he were them, he would spend his time searching another house. Hearing a noise, Alan turned his head and asked in surprise what it was. The men, hearing nothing, asked in surprise what he was saying, and asked him not to be frightened again. But the man, despite the warnings of his companions, believing in his hearing, went into the alley with a shovel in his hand, saying that he would check what was there. Leaving the men behind, and walking down the alley, Alan noted with annoyance that he had a bad feeling. His instincts told him that something was here, and that something felt like a slight presence, like the aura of an assassin. A sudden sound behind him made him turn around sharply. However, as it turned out, it was a simple mouse that had crawled out of its burrow and was quietly squeaking. Alan looked at it and thought happily to himself that it was an ordinary rat. However, when the next moment its eyes turned red and veins swelled on its face, he realized that it was far from that. The zombie rat wasn't just one, it was an army of them. Which in the next moment furious rushed at the confused guy who did not quite understand what was happening. Many small rats with red eyes began to climb up Alan's clothes, trying to bite him. With a violent swing of his shovel, which sent the rats flying in different directions, the guy finally realized why the village was in such a state. Then he swung his shovel again, which gave off a blue glow. He cursed the rats and slammed it into the ground. A small crater was formed at the spot where lightning crackled, and around it lay the defeated zombie rats. The rag that had flown away from the impact, which had been his mask earlier, landed on Alan's face. However, the zombie rats didn't like this trick, and seeing the death of their fellow rats, they rushed at the giant in front of them. Alan, realizing what a mistake he had made by killing those rats, and realizing how it could end for him, panicked and shouted at the zombie rats that he didn't mean to do it, and it wasn't on purpose. However, there was no stopping them. Having thrown the guy on the ground, they began to climb on him trying to bite him. The drama of the situation was added by the fact that the shovel, which had been given to him by Lloyd himself, as well as the weapon to which he was ready to entrust his life, flew off and sank into a puddle. The next moment, however, it began to emit a bright blue glow. While the prince was yelling at the rats trying to get in touch with them and negotiate, the water in the puddle turned from dark and dirty to crystal clear and began to sparkle with sunlight, even though it was cloudy and the sun was not visible. At the next moment, under the perplexed gaze of Alan, who did not understand what was happening, a stream of crystal clear water rose from the puddle, which grabbed the zombie rats and lifted them into the air, after which a notification window appeared in front of him, stating that the swamp death skill had been applied. Being doused with his own water that cleansed the mice and rained down on the ground, Alan, who didn't really understand what had happened, was confused and wondered what swamp was being talked about. At the same time his faithful companions, who at last dared to look into the alley, saw the prince sitting on the ground, and wondered why there were so many rats around. When they came closer, however, they were surprised to find that the muddy water in the puddle had turned into holy water. This miracle delighted the men, after which they began to ask Alan questions about how he had managed to do it and to cleanse the rats, noting that they were probably the source of the disease. He wanted to know how he had done it, however. Taking the shovel out of the puddle and cursing the prince who was the master of the body before him, he told himself that he had just learned that he could use something other than zombie summoning. Since he had never used that skill before, his first question was, could that one really purify? After some thought, he came to the conclusion that since his body was filled with holy power, because he was the grandson of a holy emperor, that's why his skill became holy. And as contradictory as it sounds, he could be a holy necromancer. And that's probably why the zombies were relatively good-natured. However, Alan's musings were interrupted by a noise. On the other side of the puddle of holy water stood a girl with blonde hair. Seeing her, both men were puzzled and surprised, as they thought that everyone had died there. As it turned out, the girl's name was Charlotte, and she lived in the neighboring house. Waving to the girl, one of the men told her to go to them, asking her where her parents were, and the second man, following the example of the first, told her that he thought she was all right. But the girl was not as harmless as she might have seemed at first sight, for in her right hand she held a large butcher knife. In the next moment, having covered several meters in a split second, she stabbed each of the men, and with glowing red eyes she appeared right in front of Alan. Despite the unexpected attack, the boy managed to block the knife, though with difficulty. Feeling the full force of the blow, from which even the handle of the shovel was cracked, Alan realized that such power could not be possessed by an ordinary girl, suggesting that she could be a zombie. However, after scaring her away to a safe distance, he immediately rejected this theory, because ordinary zombies could not use objects. Therefore, the only option left was that she had not completely turned into a zombie. The girl clenched her teeth and tears flowed from her red eyes, and she also started to make sounds like growling, which seemed to be trying to form the word mom. Alan, who was watching all this, looked at the girl with astonishment, who even managed to form a few more words, asking where her daddy was. The next moment, however, she rushed at the boy again with a knife in her hands in an attempt to stab him, but luckily Alan managed to block the attack with the shovel again. However, this time the place where the knife and the handle of the shovel came into contact with each other began to glow with a bright blue light. Seeing this, the girl's eyes widened in bewilderment. At the same time, Alan noticed that the girl's hands began to burn from contact with his holy water. Deciding that he could no longer continue to hurt her, he decided to end the girl's suffering by pushing her right into the puddle of holy water. Then he pinned her to the ground, not letting her get out. The girl, after coming into contact with the holy water, began to scream painfully and violently, trying to push the guy off her. He held her with all his strength and told her to be patient, as there were no other options for her to turn back into a human being. The girl's resistance and her desperate screams continued. But at some point they subsided and the girl's body was slowly submerged in the sacred water. The tired and wet Alan looked tiredly before him. Where in the puddle of holy water that shimmered with blue light lay a beautiful girl with white hair, who was already fully human, and who looked straight into the sky with her eyes. Her beautiful eyes remained red. A number of villagers came to see Alan sitting in one of the rooms reading a book. They told him that they had heard the news that he had been able to clear out a large pack of rats that had invaded the village. Then adding that they had also heard that he had been able to save a girl named Charlotte, they asked him to help them as well. To which Alan replied that he had not saved anyone. Then closing the book and looking at the crowd, he announced that the girl was dead. When the old man heard the prince's words, he asked Alan, who was sitting in the church pew, if the girl was really dead. He turned and asked the villagers in front of him how they thought he should save people. He added that even though he had the blood of a holy emperor in him, he had no special skills to realize it. After these words, the atmosphere among the residents changed from hopeful to disappointed and sad. Some sadly wondered what they would do with their village, while others were disappointed that despite the long journey they had made, they were unable to get the salvation they had hoped for. Unable to bear the sad situation any longer, Alan sighed. Then he turned to the people who had arrived and asked from whom they had heard that he was rescuing people. Someone in the crowd wanted to answer, but he was interrupted by the voice of a torn man who ran into the hall and immediately called loudly for the prince. Then with a carefree and joyful smile on his face he announced that Charlotte was awake. He added in a delighted voice that it was all thanks to the prince, and then began to say that he had told the girl to go back to sleep, but when he saw the crowd of people looking at him he fell silent. Finally noting that it looked like the prince had a lot of guests. At the same time the eyes of the crowd shifted from the man to Alan. Now that the truth had been revealed, everyone looked at him with angry expressions on their faces. Alan, realizing that his plan had failed, made an annoyed face and said so be it. Standing up from the bench and addressing the villagers, he said that he had no choice, as he had more divine power than they did, thinking to himself about how he had been set up by Grill and his long tongue. While the villagers couldn't understand what was wrong with the prince who was changing his mind so quickly. However, the next moment he put his index finger up and added that he had a few conditions. When Alan looked at the old man, right above him he could see a system window that displayed basic information about the old man. If the information was to be believed, his name was Parlock, he was 75 years old, and he had specialties such as gossip, farmer, and trickster. Emotionally, it said he was now full of suspicion. Such information was just right for the prince. However, he was a little surprised that even though they were asking for help, they didn't want to trust him. Was he really such a bad prince? Without dwelling on it, he turned to the villagers, saying that the condition was quite simple. Namely that he wanted money or food in exchange for his work. He also demanded that they repair the cathedral. When the people heard about the repair of the cathedral, they immediately asked if they had to repair the whole cathedral. Seeing that they weren't motivated enough, Alan replied that if they didn't want to do it, they didn't have to do it, since he didn't like the deal very much either. However, the old man, seeing that the guy was not simple, immediately replied that they were in agreement. Alan did not stop there, however, and said that he had one more important condition, and hearing this the atmosphere in the cathedral became gloomy, for no one expected that the boy would ask for so much. However, to their joy and surprise, he simply told them not to say anything about their agreement to the Holy Knights. Hearing this, the villagers replied that they agreed to the terms. Standing behind the departing people who were talking to each other about how the prince was a fraud and profited from the problems of others, Alan happily thought to himself that the cathedral for exile would finally become useful. Then he remembered the words of the old man who had told him that they needed help with the 30 corpses from the village that had become zombies. After thinking about it for a while, he concluded that it was something that could be handled. He then turned to the departing villagers and told them to take their belongings. They looked at him in bewilderment, not knowing what he meant. Seeing their confusion, Alan took his shovel in his hand and reminded them that they had asked him to deal with the zombies, then asked them if they were going to send him alone. Without waiting for an answer, he added with a sly smile that they could also wave something while he recited holy prayers. Hearing the prince's words and looking at his smile, the villagers unanimously concluded that before them was a real demon in the guise of a prince. Some even began to regret asking him to help. At the same time, the man who was closest to the window heard a growl coming from outside the building. It turned out to be zombies. The man immediately ran to the window and with his face reflected in horror against the glass, he began to shout loudly that the undead were already here. Although it was unexpected news, it did not cause much panic. The villagers began to rush around and arm themselves with self-defense items from the warehouse. Alan ran outside with a shovel in his hands and shouted loudly for the villagers to arm themselves with anything they could, even mops if they had to. But when he looked at what awaited him, he froze for a second. To his bewilderment, there were not 30 zombies as the old man had said, but an army of more than 100 zombies. And this army was now heading towards them with fierce roars. Angry at the old man, Alan turned to him and asked what was going on, to which he replied that it was his mistake, as he hadn't been able to count accurately when he ran away. These words made the boy angry, but there was no time for that now. They had a more serious task ahead of them. Namely, to destroy an army of zombies. That's what the villagers began to do. Armed with brooms and mops, they fought back the zombies quite well. The prince did not stand idly by as another zombie attacked him with a fierce roar. He had to defend himself with a shovel. Deciding not to waste any more time and finish it quickly, Alan used the Swamp of Death skill, making his shovel glow with a bright blue light. In the next moment, a stream of holy water burst out of it, which touched the zombies, causing them huge damage. For Alan to use this skill was not very difficult, since he had been a necromancer before. When he was volunteering for a beta test of a virtual reality game to make a little extra money. But in the same game, he died of electrocution. His last memory before he passed out was the smell of burnt skin. And then he woke up in this new body. Luckily, the skills from that game carried over with him, giving him a huge advantage. In addition, the holy power in his body had changed his skills, but that was a disadvantage because it was hard to control the holy power. This caused it to come out of him every time he used a skill. Wondering how to fix it, Alan was brought back to reality by someone's voice. Turning around, he saw a man sitting on the ground with a mop in his hands and desperately screaming that he couldn't take it anymore. With tears in his eyes, he said he realized they were all zombies. Turning his gaze to the woman in the pallbearer who was looking in his direction with red eyes, he added that his wife was there too. Her hand gently reached for his face, as if unwilling to part, while he wondered how he could have killed her. A single tear ran down his face. However, this was all just his fantasy, but in reality, the zombie woman lunged at him with a fierce growl. In time, however, Alan was able to disarm her before she could kill the man. "Darling," shouted the man excitedly as he saw his zombie wife fly away and fall to the ground from the prince's blow. Alan coldly told the man to stop crying and accept the fact that she was already dead. The man, shaking with anger, asked the guy what he knew. Alan pointed to his wife, who had become a zombie and no longer showed any sign of reason, and ordered the man to look at her carefully again. Then he added that her body was rotting and her soul had lost its way. Then, in a serious voice, he told the man that if he wanted his wife to stay like this and suffer, he could run away, but if he had any compassion for her, he should put aside his selfishness and start killing. While Alan was instructing the man on the right path, 3 zombies approached him and opened their mouths to rush at him with fury. Caught by surprise, the guy tried to dodge. However, something appeared in the air and caught his eye. It was someone's silhouette, which was illuminated by the sun and was approaching them at a great speed. In the next moment, the silhouette landed at a great speed and hit the ground where the zombies were, leaving no trace of them. As it turned out, it was Charlotte, who turned to Alan and asked, "Prince, are you all right?" Autumn and winter was the period of the plague, during which the whole village was plunged into darkness. Even so, Charlotte believed that it was to keep them healthy for the next year. She believed in her mother's words. However, when she returned home one day, she called out to her parents in a panic. Upon opening the door of the house, she panicked to report that there were a lot of rats outside and they were all red. However, she was never able to finish as the scene that was in front of her made her freeze on the spot with her eyes wide open. In the middle of the room on the ground sat her father, who for some reason had red eyes and dead blue skin, while in his arms lay her mother, whose neck and collar were covered in blood. At the next moment her mother, with tears in her eyes, in a weak voice turned to her and told her to run away. But she did not realize what was going on and froze at the door, trembling with fear and unable to move. The next moment the sounds of snarling zombies were heard. What Charlotte saw made her back up with a look of horror on her face. As her mom had turned into a zombie before her eyes, and they were already together with her father snarling and looking at her with rage. After this scene the girl could not remember much about what happened next. Outside the house she was chased by rats, while inside she was attacked by her parents who had turned into the living dead. She remembered grabbing the first object in her hand and waving it around. After that, all that could be heard was the snarling of zombies and the splattering of blood that streaked the walls. Sitting with her back leaning against the window behind which the zombies were roaming, with one red eye and also covered in blood marks, Charlotte pondered the fact that the people in the village had suddenly become strange. However, the zombie rats that had been trying to eat her had suddenly started ignoring her, which made her think that maybe she was turning into one of them. She didn't care now, though, because sitting alone in the middle of the room, having lost everything, she realized that no one would help her. Though perhaps if someone, even just one person, could save her. A single tear streamed down her face from her eye, which had also turned red. The next moment, however, her memories were transported to events that seemed so realistic to her, even though she found them hard to believe. A scene appeared before her in which some guy pinned her to the ground and plunged her into some puddle of glistening water, which for some reason brought her excruciating pain. However, the guy in front of her was yelling at her that she needed to hold on a little longer. Continuing to hold on despite her screams and resistance, he gritted his teeth and added that nothing else had occurred to him. The next moment her body, which had been burned by the strange water, stopped hurting and she was relieved. The next moment she woke up, opening her red eyes and staring at the ceiling with incomprehension. Breathing heavily and with her eyes wide open, she lay on her back and tried to come to her senses after such a strange dream. She wondered what those memories were, but she was torn from her thoughts by a voice that said she was finally awake. Getting up and holding her head, which was still a little sore, Charlotte asked where she was. The woman replied that she had been given a task to take care of her, and then added in a quiet voice that she should keep quiet because there were many zombies outside. Hearing the woman's words, the girl stared at her in bewilderment, trying to understand what she was talking about. Suddenly, however, her attention was drawn to the noise coming from the window. Some guy in a long coat holding a shovel was yelling at someone to stop crying and finally start killing zombies. Hearing this voice, which sounded very familiar to her, the girl froze in place as if she had seen the light she had been waiting for. The next moment she jumped off the bed and opened the window. She climbed onto the window sill, ignoring the screams of the woman who asked her what she was doing. Then with force she pushed off the window, which cracked under the girl's strength. She soared into the air, becoming the very saving silhouette the prince saw. She landed with a thunderous crash and destroyed all the zombies. Turning around and looking at him with her red eyes, she asked the prince behind her if he was okay. Turning around and looking at the prince sitting on the ground, his head covered by his own cloak, Charlotte promised herself that she would definitely save him. Looking at the scene before him, Alan could not believe his eyes. In front of him lay a huge pile of zombies that the girl had destroyed single-handedly, which caused his surprise. Looking to the side, he saw a crowd that was happily tossing the girl in the air, saying that she was their savior. Sighing, Alan concluded that the purification he'd used on her before she turned into a zombie had done something to her, but he didn't know what it was, since he wasn't particularly aware of his abilities. Deciding he would think about it later, he headed over to the rejoicing villagers, telling them to spend their time taking care of the rest of their families rather than just having fun. Adding that he knew they were tired, but it was better to get it over with quickly. The villagers nodded in agreement when they heard that. Alan added to himself that he would also help with the purification ritual. The ritual itself was quite simple. It was to bury the dead and wish them peace, so that their souls would not wander the earth, but would enjoy eternal rest. That was one of the reasons he was exiled here. It was because there was a high chance of zombies in the land of the dead spirits, so they needed someone to take care of the dead, Alan reasoned to himself as he looked up into the sky at the blue souls that were emitting a blue glow. However, even if this was the case, it still seemed unusual to him, since he had never seen a record of so many villages being in danger at the same time before. Since even now, it was still very early for the death wave. Finishing his thoughts, he turned to an old man standing nearby, who immediately turned around at his voice. Alan asked him if everything was normal in the village, and if there had been any strange or unusual events lately. He answered that nothing had happened. But he added that the plague had started about a month ago. Upon hearing this, Alan immediately gave his verdict. There was a necromancer here. This seemingly ordinary phrase for a guy, gave the villagers a great deal of terror. Everywhere began to sound excited voices that it was probably the one who dispelled the plague, and that he was probably a demon who sealed the spirits. As Alan listened to all this nonsense, he looked contemptuously at the villagers and said that everything they were saying was wrong. The villagers, however, apologized to themselves at the mere mention of it, but thanks to this he was able to come to a conclusion. Namely, that if his theory was correct, the one who controlled the zombies was not far away. However, he didn't know how to find this person. Deciding that he could think about it later, he waved goodbye to the villagers and said he was going to sleep, while he told them to take care of the rest. They wished him a good night and thanked him and went on with their work. When he entered the cathedral he asked himself irritably why he was called a prince if he was there as a laborer. He approached his favorite, the best, the softest, the most beautiful. Okay, let's stop there. He tired and exhausted from the whole day he plopped down on her, after which he sighed in relief. Then he began to fall asleep, thinking that he needed to rest, as the funeral had tired him out. The next morning a loud scream woke Alan, who jumped up and tried to realize what was going on. Still sleepy, he went to the window and wondered what could have happened so early in the morning. But the next words that came from outside were not the most pleasant. Zombies have kidnapped someone. Zombies kidnapping people? Asked Alan as he left the house. One of the guys excitedly replied that he had seen it with his own eyes, while the other nodded in agreement with his friend. Then the first guy continued his story, saying that since they had been working all night, they were exhausted. The zombies took advantage of that and took Morian with them. The guy finished his story. Alan didn't pay attention to the rest of the story and asked who Morian was. He scratched the back of his head and said that she was a young lady who often gathered medicinal herbs. She was also a great help to the village, as well as a healer. Alan interrupted the boy and asked if he knew her. To which the boys looked at each other and answered that she was a beauty. And then added that she was the one who had rejected his confession. And that's why he tried to kill himself. Not wanting to hear any more of this, Alan said he remembered and asked them to stop. The next moment one of the guys loudly announced that now they should gather a search party and go after the girl. Hearing this Alan thought with annoyance about why these goons were so eager when it came to rescuing the pretty girl. On the other hand he also realized that he should check what had happened. Since this was the first time he had ever seen a zombie kidnap a human, he decided to figure out what was wrong with the situation. Putting on his cloak he casually asked if there was any way to trace the girl. One of the boys replied that Sir Hans, who was a hunter in their village, could help him. When Alan heard this, he said that they were going to get down to business, and a pleased look appeared on the boys' faces. Then he ordered them to get the hunter to help them find the girl. Alan turned around and saw Charlotte standing in front of him, staring at him from a distance. Passing by her he looked with interest at the girl who never took her eyes off him. Feeling her gaze on him even as he walked away from her, Alan wondered if she held a grudge for knocking her out. But deciding not to think about it, he shouted to the guys that they should hurry up if they didn't want the girl to become lunch for the zombies. Then they rushed after him with a confident shout. Charlotte silently continued to watch them go. Following the hunter, who said that the zombies were dragging their feet behind them and that their footprints would not be hard to find, he finally led them to the entrance of the cave and said that he was sure that what they needed was inside. He praised Hans for a job well done. Alan was pleased to note that he had managed to track them down after all. For he felt that the cave was filled with an eerie demonic energy. It wouldn't be surprising if it was full of zombies, or even the source of the plague. Although there were even places that accumulated demonic energy on their own. But in this case, judging by the zombies' actions, there was a high probability that someone was behind them. Turning to the guys who came along with him, he suddenly suggested burning the place to the ground. Hearing this, they excitedly replied that Morian was still inside. The prince pointed his finger inside the cave and said that it was quite gloomy, which made the zombies in such a place stronger. So if someone ran inside to save one girl, it would be the end of everyone. Hearing this, one of the guys holding a rake asked confusedly what they should do. He replied that the best option would be to get ready and go back, but then of course the chance of the girl's survival would be less. Suddenly behind Alan there was a growl. Not realizing what was happening, he turned around in surprise. Behind him was nothing but the huge toothy face of a zombie bear, which opened its mouth to eat him. Alan cried out in fright and bent his body to dodge the bear's attack, which had already set its teeth on him. At the same time the villagers who had come with him rushed to his aid. But it was too late, for the bear had already bitten the prince on the shoulder, causing him to moan painfully. Seeing only his feet and the villagers who ran after him, Alan was dragged along the ground by none other than the zombie bear. The very next moment he suddenly found himself in free fall, being thrown off a cliff by his delivery bear. But even in flight and with a bleeding wound on his shoulder, he managed to use the skill with his shovel, which he still held in his hand. The zombie bear was immediately hit by a stream of holy water, which, judging by his painful roar, brought him not a little pain. Alan, who had made a soft landing, immediately grabbed the wound using a skill. It was called a terrible curse, but despite the name, when he put his hand on the wound, it began to heal. Seeing the good result, he said to himself that it was just as he thought, it was a recovery spell. Even though his divine power was at its lowest point, but at times like this it was very useful to have his skills working in reverse. However, things weren't as good as they might have seemed at first glance, as the bear appeared and had already recovered. Standing on two legs and looking at Alan, it seemed even more terrifying than before. If the system window that displayed information about the creature was to be believed, it was a king of gluttony whose age was unknown, specialty was bite, cut, crash. It also indicated at the end that it was enhanced by a necromancer. After reading the last line, Alan was surprised by the information, but it explained the fact that he was standing on his feet after the holy water. Besides, it would be much harder to fight him if someone was controlling him. But all this was not as important as the problem he had in front of him, namely how to defeat the bear by brute force. The bear waited for the boy to think of something and with a fierce roar rushed at Alan, who put his shovel in front of him and tried to take the blow, but at the last moment he dodged, so that the bear's teeth grabbed only air. The bear became even more angry and lunged at the boy again, intending to strike him with his clawed paw. But he was not allowed to do so. Charlotte landed on top of him like a ray of light and plunged her knife into his red eye. It took him by surprise, and he froze in place for a second, only growling painfully. But as it turned out, he wasn't planning to die yet. And with a very loud roar he rose up on two paws. Sitting on the ground, Alan saw Charlotte and wondered why she had followed him. But he realized that he would have to think about it later, because now he had more pressing problems to solve. A huge bear that was even more ferocious than before, and which even Charlotte, despite her strength, could not hold back. The next moment she was thrown to the floor, hitting the ground with force. In the next second the bear struck her where she had been, but luckily she rolled to the side and dodged it. But that was not the end of it, as the bear immediately opened its jaws and lunged at the girl, who was still on her feet. Having no other choice, she stuck her knife right into the bear's mouth. The bear's mouth was bleeding and it began to growl, but despite the pain, it continued to press Charlotte. But the next moment a blow came from the bear's face, knocking it right into the cave wall. At the same time Alan said that she had helped him a lot, buying him time to use the skill. The girl looked at the outstretched hand and replied that she should have thanked him too. However, in place of a regular hand in front of her was a blue hand of a zombie. The girl was stunned by what she saw, and a million questions began to pop into her head. What? Isn't that Mr. Allen? Don't tell me he's turned into a zombie. It can't be, it's been too short a time. He was bitten by a zombie. What's going on? Why is his arm blue? What kind of zombie arm? This is how you fight, said Alan, whereupon zombies started to come out of the ground. Charlotte had already come to her senses and was staring at the sight in surprise and confusion. He grinned insidiously. Alan, standing in the middle of the crowd of zombies that appeared around him, he said with a smile on his face that it was impossible for the bear to win when there were so many of them. Alan's army of zombies immediately attacked the bear, biting it from all sides and preventing it from moving freely. The bear roared in pain, trying to throw off the pesky dead things that were tearing off pieces of flesh with their teeth. But even though Charlotte had gouged out his eye, the zombie bear was not going to give up and roared with a frothy roar. In the next few moments, he was able to throw several zombies off of him and throw them into the wall of the cave. As it turned out, this was not enough, as new zombies took the place of those zombies, and more dead arms began to appear from the ground, which fed to hold the bear. The bear stood up on its hind legs once more, roaring furiously with powerlessness as more and more zombie hands emerged from the ground. Alan watched the fight and realized that the bear had really nailed a lot of people, and that was the only reason he was able to summon such a large crowd of zombies. Charlotte looked at the fight confusedly and didn't know what was going on. As the pieces of the summoned zombies flew around the cave, Alan thought to himself that this bear was much stronger than his guys, but in the end it didn't matter. The enraged bear with its bloody maw made one last desperate attempt to attack. And lunged at Alan, who didn't even move and stood calmly looking at him. The next moment the bear's blood spurted onto the floor of the cave, but the bear stood still for some time. But finally he began to fall, his tongue hanging out of his bloody mouth, a knife sticking out of his head, which Charlotte had stuck there, finishing the bear's torment. Alan realized that the outcome of the fight was obvious. No matter how strong the bear was, it didn't stand a chance against so many zombies. Charlotte started to pull the knife out of the bear's head, but noticed that Alan wasn't okay and asked him how he was. Seeing that he was barely on his feet, she gave him her shoulder to lean on. Alan told her that he was fine, he was just using too much divine power. He looked around the battlefield and asked himself why Charlotte was here. Had she come to punch him for his behavior in the village or what? But there was another problem he needed to address immediately. Charlotte had seen his power and needed to make up for that nuance somehow. Charlotte took things in her own way, and when Alan started to ask her to leave him alone and not tell his secret to anyone, she thought he was saying he wanted to live peacefully in his exile, so it would be good if his power was their secret. Charlotte was in awe of the prince's nobility and self-sacrifice. At the same time, the Real Alan, with a sour face, was simply telling her to leave him alone and that he wouldn't pester her again if she kept everything a secret. Charlotte assured him that since he had saved her life, she would listen to whatever he wanted. Alan had a logical question as to how he could have saved her life. However, before he could fully ask his question, voices were heard from above, calling for the prince and Charlotte. It was the guys from the village who had brought the equipment for the descent into the cave, and now they had a lot of questions: why Charlotte had ducked down there and how the prince was still alive after the bear attack. They began to rappel down into the cave. Alan tossed to himself that they would be of absolutely no use and they should have gone home. As one of them got closer, he immediately saw a pile of dead zombies and a bear and asked them who could have done such a thing. Was it really the two of them? This bear was known as the king of gluttony and no one knew exactly how many people it had killed. Charlotte couldn't come up with an excuse, but Alan could. He hypothesized that there is or was a necromancer in this cave. And seeing the uncomprehending look on the village boy's face, he went on to explain that the necromancer had tried to set up his lair here and had killed a bear that was in his way, so when they arrived all those monsters were already dead. Such a simple lie was enough for the boys from the village, and Alan remarked to himself how simple they were. Remembering the purpose of their visit here, he thought that Maureen must be dead by now, since she was most likely just the usual bait with which the villain had tried to lure them here in hopes of killing more people with his bear. The frightened boy from the village asked him what they should do. Alan sighed in exhaustion and said they should go further into the depths of the cave. Not believing his ears, the boy asked him if he was sure. Alan answered him that he was. Although his face showed no emotion, his real goal was to see how good that necromancer was and what he had in store for them next. They all together cautiously began to go deeper and deeper into the cave, which seemed empty and lifeless. After a while they reached a small lake in the cave, into which drops were constantly falling from the stalactites above. Behind the lake they could see a passage. They cautiously approached it and peered into it. One of the guys was the first to notice the bound girl and immediately called the prince over there. It turned out to be the same Maureen. The guys from the village immediately ran to her, telling her that they had come to rescue her. However, their enthusiasm was not shared by Alan. Something was not right here. He quickly put all the facts together in his head. wondering how she could be alive. If she was the bait, why the necromancer didn't kill her and take control of her. There could only be one explanation. It was her. Meanwhile, the still-bound Morian turned to the prince. She masterfully played the innocent girl who was happy to be saved. She tearfully asked everyone if they had really come all for her. But the very next moment Alan, whom she had failed to see off, hit her over the head with a shovel. The one pretending to be Morian fell to the ground. Everyone else was shocked by his actions and didn't realize what was happening. They started hysterically asking the prince what he was doing. He paid no attention to their screams, and only carelessly told his captive that he should have hit her with the sharp side of the shovel, but he had some questions. One of the boys ran up to Morian, asking if she was okay. As the others pounced on the prince with questions about what he was doing, Alan started to explain to them that he could see everything, and an information window popped up in front of him, stating that Morgana was in front of him, who was 63 years old and specialized in black magic, dismemberment, curses, and murder. He'd said everything in his voice, she'd never been bait. However, Morgana wasn't going to give up so easily and started making excuses that they must have misunderstood something. However, her pathetic attempts to justify herself were interrupted by Alan saying that he didn't care what she said and told the others not to fall for her tricks. After all, she was the same necromancer that had terrorized their village. Everyone stammered in bewilderment. Alan continued that everything they knew about her was a lie, her name, age and all. Morgana realized in horror that he knew everything about her and now there was no getting away from her. She didn't give up her desperate attempts to justify herself, however, she screamed that it was the necromancer who had dragged her here and then tortured her. Alan teased with a chuckle, saying yes, of course. He asked her if she really thought people would trust her just because she was nice to them and started pulling something out of his pocket. He pulled out a bottle of holy water from there and offered her to drink it to confirm his words. That way they would know exactly who she was, because for a necromancer this holy water would be lethal and their internal organs would melt, but for humans it was the best medicine and then all her wounds would be healed. Morgana tried to refuse the holy water with the excuse that it was not worth wasting such a valuable thing on it. To which Alan mockingly replied that that's right, she refuses the water just because it is valuable. And then approached her about to force her to drink the vial with a gloating smirk, knowing what would happen next. Morgana had no choice, she had to either confess and then be killed immediately or drink the holy water and die in agony as well.